I've been in here in Austin since 2015. I'm involved in the community in two collectives, so Icosa Collective and Black Mountain Project. And I'm also, as of this summer, the chair of Art in Public Places for the City of Austin Cultural Funds Arts. So.
Very cool. Thank you so much for being here today. Next, we have Elaina Brown-Spence. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Elaina Brown-Spence. I am a printmaker, artist, illustrator, creative writer. I'm currently at a program in Philadelphia studying to get my master's in printmaking and book arts. My work primarily deals with being a Black woman and a woman of color and women's rights. So thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you. And then last but not least, Dr. Carey Cordova, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I teach in the Department of American Studies. I'm also associate director for the Center for Mexican American Studies. I do a lot of research on Latino art historically and think a lot about representation and race and identity and politics. So that's, and I'm deeply honored to be included on this panel. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you today. And again, thank you to all our panelists for being here. So our focus today, for those of us, or for those of you just joining us, is going to be covering racism within the art community. Our esteemed panelists sent in a few talking points that they wanted to cover last week, and we're going to be touching on several topics today. We're going to leave room towards the end of the discussion for questions for the audience members to send in, but please feel free to send in your questions throughout the panel, and we'll be able to incorporate those into our discussion. So y'all, let's jump right in. I think we should start talking about, problematic museums, institutions, communities, systematic racism, and exclusionary behavior. Would anybody like to start?
Wow, that's a really big, big topic. I guess I would say that I've now been a practicing art historian for almost 30 years. And I've been surprised at how little has changed in the couple of decades that I've been in art history and in the museum field. Back in the 90s, when I got my undergraduate degree and was working in museums, there were big pushes to integrate, I'll put that in air quotes, curatorial departments in museums, and there was lots of money to have fellowships and internships in the hopes that museums would be different places. And to a certain extent, it worked in that there are some of us, and I would say that, some of us, like Thelma Golden were subject and or had these fellowships. I certainly had them. Gwendolyn Shaw had them. So there are some of us who are kind of in our mid-careers who had them back in the day. And it is, kind of surprising to me when I read articles in the New York Times, among other places, that are calling for a kind of wholesale integration of mainstream museums when it was something that, we thought we were doing back in the 90s. And so in some ways, I feel like it's the changing same, that mainstream museums are really not opening their doors to the intellectual workers who are people of color, though they might be collecting a bit more. So maybe that's where I will start.
I can go next.
Yeah, please.
My experience in academia as a student is oftentimes I experience tokenism with being a student and having them pick one Black person to represent the school. And oftentimes, from being from a mixed heritage, I am not that perfect Black person they want to promote. So oftentimes I feel like opportunities are like hoarded for certain types of people that they want to promote, as opposed to being more open to all people of color. Like, it's the model minority, tokenism, and also not understanding like what the work is behind, sort of.
Yeah, that sounds like it speaks to what Dr. Smith was saying as well. People not really opening their doors to many people of color. And Tammie, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't work for a museum, but I'm someone who, you know, is constantly goes to museums. And so I'm from Chicago. And when the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, moved into its new building, I probably was in grade school. And so unlike the Art Institute, which is such a huge museum, the MCA was something that you can walk into and be, you know, walk in and walk out and be in like 2 hours, right? And I remember from both of those institutions, Chicago at that time was probably about 50% Black, but that you would see this crossover where you would go into that institutions and the Black people were guards, and you saw no representation anywhere else, including how many people felt welcome to actually use the space of the gallery itself, to be included in the museum. If you looked at the events, if you looked like who felt invited, who felt comfortable, right? And I've seen some of those things change now, but you know, I don't live in Chicago, but I literally go to the MCA once to twice a year whenever I'm in Chicago. And I have seen some changes where now when I come through the door, I will see more Black people, more people of color who are attending, and more people who are like working there and not just as museum guards, but it's still not enough, right? It feels like the barriers to those kinds of works are like steeped in economics, and the economics of it is still that internships, you know, in graduate schools, some of that is like just not accessible to a lot of people, right? And so if you can do an internship and you still have to pay your rent, and you have no one to, you know, if your parents aren't able to financially help you, if you're you know, saving up for the next year's tuition, then doing something like an unpaid internship or something with a very small stipend does not help get enough people to go down that path to really make changes in the institution. So I feel like it has to be both. It's not just top down, it's like the education and the way that we fund things and the institution, it needs to be kind of like a flattening that comes together and meets in the middle. And I feel like that is still the thing that is missing. And I also see, it seems like in the institutions, educational institutions that I've been involved with, there's always this feeling too that, well, we've got one or two and we've done a good job and that's good enough, right? And you can kind of see them patting themselves on the back for it. And the other thing is that making the few people of color that are there, like they should be so grateful to be there, right? Not that they haven't worked, you know, hard to get there, not that they're not pulling their weight, not that they're not doing the things that they're supposed to do, but that you should still feel grateful while knowing you're probably being underpaid and asked to do additional labor, you know? So when we talk about equity, I want us to talk about it in all the different ways, because inviting people into your institution, and I'm sorry guys, I feel like ranting a little bit, but I just saw something on Twitter about a college that's gonna have all the freshmen take a 1-credit class of anti-racism. And I think that's fantastic. But then my second question was, who gets to teach that class? Who teaches that? Is that going to be an overload for a professor of color? Are they going to be able to use that when they're going up for tenure? Is it going to be seen as service? Is it going to be both helpful to them in their careers? Is it going to be something that they're penalized for because they want to do the work? And so, yeah.
No, I think that's a great point, and I'm really glad that you point that out. Dr. Cordova, it looks like you're ready.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can follow that. I mean, I 100% just agree with what you're pointing out, Tammie, just about where will the work land, right? Like, and that's a deep concern. And at the same time, I think Dr. Smith was pointing out some of the inequities of singular white organizing. And so that's maybe something we could also talk about. I think for me, Cherise and I have talked a little bit about like how we've come at this from different disciplines, right? And I've always admired her willingness to enter into the art history fray, because for me, it was a very sort of intimidating space. And I always felt like it was very difficult to break in or to recognize ethnic art, right, as it was called, within the field of American art. And I think that became like a point of where I never felt entirely welcome. And still a lot of my work has really been about trying to understand that contestation, or trying to understand, you know, what is making American art. And so a lot of my research has been dedicated to that, and trying to put a spotlight on some of the artists that are not necessarily included in the classic curriculum. But also sort of marveling at these moments that there are moments of boom, right? So the moments when like there's a constant sort of Latino discovery that happens, you know, and so you have like Latino music, oh, it's a hit right now, right? Or Latino art. And I think a lot about, you know, an early exhibit, the Chicano Art Resistance and Affirmation exhibit that occurred, what was it, late 80s, early 90s? And the fact that people lined up outside the museum, right? Latinos were lining up, like there were lines of people just to participate and see this kind of art. And so what often happens is like this perception that people of color will not go to the museum, or they will not go to the theater, right? And so trying to also disinter some of those ideas that I think float around within like the superstructures of museums, and persist in creating these lines of segregation that don't necessarily need to exist. But also thinking about the dollars that follow that, and the funding, and all the ways in which that sort of contributes to this perception. And just maybe, again, thinking historically about some of the ways in which organizing for neighborhood arts in San Francisco in like the late 1960s, 70s, which is an area where I focus on, it became about like, why is the symphony getting so much money, you know, but these arts organizations in smaller neighborhoods, these arts organizations dedicated to teaching children, are not? And how can we make this situation much more equitable and inclusive? And so that's something that tends to still frame a lot of the ideas that I have about inclusion. So I'll leave it there.
No, those are all great points, and I think it actually comes back around to what Tammie was saying before about you know, who's going to have to identify these things, and who's going to be that person. And it sounds like, you know, you're that person in this sense, and you know, that sounds amazing, but also exhausting. I can't imagine it's easy. And you know, Dr. Cordova, you mentioned the symphony in San Francisco. I think this would be a good time to talk about funding within different arts organizations, specifically cultural arts organizations, like culture specific. You see that a lot in smaller communities, with the larger institutions gaining all this funding, and then the smaller institutions basically just fighting for it. Would anybody like to speak to that?
I've been interested in the issue of ethnically specific museums for a long time, and you know, there's this moment in the late 60s and early 70s, right after the civil rights movement, and as Black Power, Chicano movement, AIM are all getting started, that we have these small ethnically specific institutions, some of which are art focused, maybe some are theater focused, that get created. And some of them have stayed on and held on for a long time, and others have not. Studio Museum in Harlem is one that first got started with the Whitney Museum of Art, just kind of saying, okay, let's give you this small space and see if it continues on, and it does. But not without fits and starts and not without kind of hurdles. And, you know, there have been kind of periodic moments when it had to reframe itself and rethink what it does. And sometimes it's more African-American focused, and sometimes it's differently African-American focused. I guess I would say that I, as some of you know, started an ethnically specific museum gallery on campus on the University of Texas, and it's called Christian Green Gallery. The other is the Idea Lab. Those are together called the Art Galleries at Black Studies, and they're two small exhibition spaces that, you know, we're interested in kind of promoting art that deals with the narratives of people of African descent, but that is one frame, but not the only frame. And so we're interested in showing work by Black people, but we're not solely showing work by Black people. We have certainly shown art, and we will continue to show art that deals more broadly with issues of identity, with issues of social justice, equity, inequity, representation, big ideas like that. And so, you know, you have to kind of think through what an ethnically specific museum does, or an ethnically specific institution does, different than others. And so I think what we do is in some ways niche, but also kind of representing universally. And where a larger institution that is supposed to be a universal institution or an encyclopedic institution, let's say the Metropolitan Museum of Art, let's say the Blanton, they are supposed to be universal, but what they're really representing is white and Western culture. And so, you know, thinking through the framing of different kinds of museums is an important thing to do. And so I guess I would say that I have some real frustration about how, about the framing of all museums, or especially ones who consider themselves universal, because they are in fact also ethnically specific. I'll take a breath because I talked a lot.
Oh, would someone else like to contribute, Elena?
I had something to say, but if you would like to go first, that's fine.
I'll just throw down a couple of thoughts just about the funding issue, because of course that is like a huge point of contention and inclusion, and I think that, you know, that's exactly the point about the symphony, right? Is like, who's the symphony serving and why are they, you know, the fundamental. So it's not that the symphony is, you know, fundamentally white. It just happens to serve an audience that has in the past been so, right? And so I'm just thinking about like, okay, how do you redirect funds? And one of the things that I was thinking about in pausing, you know, solutions, right? We were talking about, well, we're going to talk about problems, but we're going to talk about solutions. And I have to just look into the past. And so something else we could talk about are like, you know, how did the WPA work? How did it hire artists? How did it give them jobs? And how did it treat art as a respectable form of labor, right? Beyond simply being shown in museums, right? But also just like, you know, the act of inclusion in that way. And And similarly, something that I've thought a lot about is the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, right, in 1970s, which was turned into a way also to employ artists, right? And it was inspired by the WPA, right? It was the Comprehensive Employment Training Act. It wasn't specifically for artists, but then people found a way to make it an opportunity to employ artists. And I happen to know like some people in San Francisco right now are looking like, how can we take some of this federal funding and imitate those things that we did with CETA, with WPA, and try to again sort of replicate that and make sure that we're, you know, not just saying like, oh, that's great art, but we actually want to pay you for it. So I'll throw that down.
I had some thoughts based on like universities, like who have been accused of racism, all of a sudden have multi-ethnic programs like the next week to like prove that they're not racist, when really nothing has changed. They've just recataloged some of their courses to better fit the way they want them to look. And I think the problem with that is that there is no implication of real change or understanding, and jobs aren't being allocated for people of color to teach classes that are based in culture. And I think it's a real uphill battle for people to have to build these programs and then them go away because they were just meant for show in the first place, when they weren't actually meant to institutionalize change. So that's what
So I would say it's, I want to talk about funding in relation to maybe past acts and current acts and like future acts. So serving for the art in public places, I feel like the city actually has done a much better job recognizing equity, and it is at the forefront of a lot of their policies. However, having it now does not erase the past. And how do you repair when people have they have been marginalized, neglected, shut out of the funds for the city in the past, right? And so when you have this history of, saying that, you're not wanted, your labor is not wanted, your work is not wanted, and that changes, there still has to be a way for people to have proof, right? So they come back to you, like, you're like, well, please apply. Well, okay, you're gonna apply, but like people are already still, they're hurt from the past experiences, right? And then how do you do some sort of reparation? How do you repair? And that's difficult because that takes, that's not something that you can just establish by a policy, right? There's no like workshop that's going to do that. And part of that, to me, it seems like it's outreach, but it means that it takes longer period of time to reach out to individuals in the community who are longstanding and to tap them specifically in a way to include them into the institution so that they can see the changes happen and go back out to say change has happened. I just don't always think it can happen from the inside out. And so how do you make that happen? How can you, I think your symphony example is really great. I mean, is it that many people that go to the symphony, or is it the fact that the symphony has better PR? They have more people on staff. They have more promotional information. They have more people talking about it on the radio. You know what I mean? So places suffer from being able to even offer more opportunities because a lot of times they're also like understaffed and they don't have the people on the inside of the institution to be able to make those connections.
Can I jump in here on the kind of question of why the symphony and not culturally specific organizations or smaller organizations? I mean, we also have to talk about high art versus low art and the culture that's associated with so-called high art. And so when we're talking about the symphony, we're talking about Western European, for the most art practices that have been going on for thousands of years. So on the one hand, that's all well and good, but when you are thinking about Native Mexican practices or indigenous American practices that have been in existence for as long as the makers of great music have. And one gets said or described as low or, you know, less interesting, less evolved, and one gets described as higher and better and more evolved, then we're talking fundamentally about racism and discrimination. But it's you know, kind of worse than that and deeper than that. And it's those long-standing biases that we're still living with today.
I'll just even add that some of those biases are even like created, right? Cherise, like, I mean, I'm thinking specifically about the opera, which, I mean, everyone thinks, oh, opera, that is very high, you know, but initially it wasn't, right? It was created for the masses to enjoy entertainment, right? And so just the construction of high art that we need to really interrogate and not necessarily just buy into it being like, it's always been high art. It's always been sort of elevated in this way. And really thinking just, you know, that's a recent construction. I didn't really mean to beat up on the symphony specifically. It just occurred to me as like, you know, one of those historical examples of people trying to point out like how are they not being included and why is so much money going in that direction but not in this other direction. And I think we also see these periods, these moments when the funding is changing, right? And so we see this back and forth sort of maneuvering. And in the 1980s, we could definitely see like the backlash against the National Endowment for the Arts, right? And like as a sort of conservative revolution was taking hold and any kind of arts funding suffered dramatically in that moment. And we're still trying to figure out what's happening in this moment of COVID and trying to figure out like in this moment when people are attending to Black Lives Matter, but maybe only just to, you know, avoid the kind of shame that I think Elaina was pointing out to some degree. So we don't know how long this will last also as we're trying to gauge. And I think that that's also something that Tammie was pointing out about the issue of trust and the ways in which, like, if you want the trust, then there has to be a much longer relationship and investigation and sort of, you know, thought about what has happened in the past.
Danielle,
can I just add one more thing too? Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say too that I also think the counter to that is as well as like taking up space, like without apology, putting yourself in, if you feel safe, putting yourself in spaces that also belong to you, right? And so when Millennial Park was up and running, I would visit Chicago, visit my home, and I was talking to my aunt who lives in Hyde Park. It's very close to downtown. She just has to take Lakeshore. And I said, hey, you know, there's all those jazz festivals and things like that. Do you ever go down there? And she's like, no. And I said, but you live in this like place, you live in this great community where it's very easy for you to get to these institutions that are free. You pay taxes here. You've been a teacher here for, 40 plus years. This is your city. That park is your park, right? And so, she got her friends got together. She had her granddaughter call her an Uber, and they got in the Uber and they went down to the park. And so I think there's also this thing is like, if you think that, take up space, it's your space. It belongs to you. It's not for, just someone else. And I think the act of doing that can kind of like, as you were saying, like when they had that exhibition, or when it's a movie or anything where they say like, oh, the movie made so much money, we couldn't even imagine. And they say that every single time that it's a, like a Black movie or a Latinx movie when it does well. Well, if you see it every single time, it's no longer an anomaly, right? All right. So I think that this idea of like also like trying to take up that space and as an act of rebellion, and rebellions don't always have to be big, they can be small actions.
Danielle, I was just going to point out that there's a question in the Q&A.
We do have one here with the Zoom link. We have several coming from Facebook as well. We can address it now if you'd like to for this one.
I didn't know if you knew that it was there. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Smith. So we do have a question from one of our audience members, and it speaks to directly what we've been talking about. And it's, how do you feel about the idea of galleries who only represent minorities? Do you think this idea of separating POCs, women, etc., from other museums will eventually improve the issue of underrepresentation of minorities in museums or make it worse? And I think that's a big question to unpack. So maybe we want to start with a little bit of it and then move on from there.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, I guess
would actually be interested to hear what. Should I start again?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I would actually be interested in hearing about the mission of Mexicarte.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mexic-Arte, our mission is to preserve and promote Latinx, Latin American, and Mexican art through the preservation and education of the community. We're very community centered, very community based here, and I think I don't know. I'm very proud to be a part of the Mexic-Arte Museum, and I'm very proud of the community that we built here. And I think that we have had this conversation very often, especially lately, about cultural specific and ethnic specific spaces, and trying to make sure that we're not being exclusionary, that we're inviting everyone from our community and not just people who look like us or people who have our same experiences, because in that sense we'll never be able to grow.
I'd like to speak to it a little bit. I've been formulating what I think on this because it was a very big question. And on the part that says, do you think it helps or hurts? I don't think it hurts at all to have culturally specific galleries or museums, because everything in a sense that is shown in museums or gallery is specific to the vision they want to promote, like European art, Asian art, Black art, Hispanic art. I feel like every museum has an idea of what they like to show. I do think more institutions like galleries should be more open to different types of art, because I feel like that's very based in what culture is, like what they perceive to be the most popular art. And oftentimes it's not people of color's art. They don't feel like it can reach a wider audience, which I think is why culturally specific galleries and museums need to exist, to highlight people of color until the world decides to or we force them to open up their eyes and realize our experiences are just as valid and we are just as important as painters from Tennessee painting about I don't know what they're painting about, but whatever.
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question. And actually I know who this is. This is one of my students, Victoria. Hello. So I think that we have to think about the fact that as artists, we are we're kind of at the mercy of spaces, right? We want to show our work, we have to show them in spaces. And what kind of gallery exhibitions are we able to have? So if, there are smaller and more specific institutions that would allow you to have a little bit more experimental, or to allow you to have a solo exhibition instead of being in a group exhibition, or the fact that, women in their work by the fact that it only shows women. And that means that there's all different kind of artists who are women are able to have an exhibition there. So there's just not one type, right? And sometimes in these these other institutions, yes, they will have maybe one show, two shows, but is it also the same artists that that show is going to go from, you know, one art institution to the next art institution to the next art institution, right? The same show. That's not opening it up for other artists, right? And so I think that as many opportunities as possible for minority artists to have shows, LGBTQI, whatever those things are, and especially in spaces where they could have conversations in their work or be more experimental in their work or have an installation of their work that allows them to really kind of expand and to have that on in their roster and their portfolio as an experience to get writing about their work, to get other curators in to see that work and be able to use those, you know, as a generative act. I don't think that can ever hurt. If you, if people are going to marginalize you, they're going to marginalize you. And it's not about the fact that you are showing at a certain kind of institution, it's about their personal bias.
I think that's a great point, Tammie, and thank you so much for pointing that out. And Dr. Cordova, looks like you want to chime in?
I think everyone has offered some good points on this. So my points are just modest, but just thinking like the history of galleries of people of color is actually, you know, it's not that long. It's not, and so they're really, really important. They've been fulfilling a role that has not been available because mainstream institutions simply haven't done it. And so, I mean, you know, I mean, whether it's Black, Latinx, Indigenous, women, you know, the mainstream museums haven't accomplished this goal yet. And all we have to do is get onto any social media or Twitter or anything, and we will see that that is the case. So they're playing an important role. They evolved out of playing an important role, right? Because, you know, in addition, like, of course, there's a fight for equality, for equity, for equal representation. But at some point, if that's not happening, then separate structures and institutions also need to evolve to fulfill those kinds of objectives. And I really love Tammie's point just about, like, you know, you need many of them, right? Because I think, you know, especially looking at Latinx art, like Chicano art has dominated a lot of those conversations, right? But how does Salvadoran art, how does Central American representation fit into there? How do we look at Caribbean Latinx art? Like, how can we, you know, really sort of diversify our understanding? And so spaces become really integral to those conversations.
I think that's a really good point, Dr. Cordova. And, you know, I think I'd like to expand on that a little bit if everyone is comfortable with that. Just talking about, you know, identity and identity within, you know, different communities within the BIPOC population. And really, you know, an artist's choice in their identity, whether they want to lean into it or maybe don't think that they should because they don't think that their art would be shown as much. You know, there's a lot of different ways you can look at it, but you know, in terms of identifiers and cross identifiers, what do you think are some problems within that, with maybe artists being excluded because they identify with one identifier more than another? And let me know if I need to rephrase that, because that was a large question as well.
Are there particular examples you're thinking of, Danielle?
So I guess I would like to point out the contemporary example. I believe Dr. Smith, you sent that over. It's from an Instagram account called Change the Museum, and they've been posting anonymous quotations from different people who have had experiences within museums. And this particular person was interviewing for a curatorial assistant position. And when they talked about how they had previously had a culture-specific background, the curator told them that that's not what they did at the Contemporary. So I think maybe this particular person, who I believe is Latinx of Latinx descent, was immediately kind of shut down because of that identifier, and because they chose to be a part of that community, and then decided to work with, or tried to work with a more mainstream museum/gallery.
Yeah, I saw that post and I was dismayed by it. I was dismayed by it because on the one hand, I thought that it was probably an honest representation of how the Contemporary sees itself, in that it does mostly show art by white people. And it is not always showing, or perhaps I should say, it's not equitably showing art by people of color. And, you know, how we would figure that out, would we say, the population of Texas is more than 50% Latinx, so shouldn't half of the shows at the Contemporary be Latinx? Should 47% of them, or what have you, be white? And should, you know, 11%, which I think is the population of Texas, be the number of Black exhibitions that are there? How you actually parcel out what is the correct percentages and or representation is tricky. So I will say that. You know, I think that there's, as I was kind of pointing out, a couple of problems. That there's an assumption that as it's being presented in this post, I should say, because we haven't heard from the Contemporary on this, that they recognize what they're interested in and they recognize what they're not interested in. And that they are leaving it to so-called ethnically specific museums to show ethnically specific artists. So, I mean, what I would say is that ethnically specific is a specious and wrong-minded term in the first place, because all of us have ethnicities. We are either Irish American or German American or Brazilian American, for example, even regardless of what color our skins are. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so many things wrong with that Instagram post of that worker who studies Latinx art. And, you know, it really kind of broke my heart when I read it. It made me sad.
It reminds me a lot of the sort of the historic repression of teaching a second or of speaking a second language like Spanish, right? Like instead of representing that as a skill, as an asset, as a way of thinking differently, as a capacity to move between worlds and to translate, it's regarded by some as a detriment, as, you know, like that should stop. You should only speak English. You should only think in this way. And so it's both like a very familiar sort of formula of disregard, long-standing, so familiar, and yet I share Cherise's sort of like dismay, right? Like now in this moment that someone is having that experience, and you know, absolutely, we don't know all the context, but somebody feels that right now, right? Also, like that's the feeling that they have left with, in that there has been a disregard of something that actually could have been such an incredible asset to this museum. So,
you know, I think when you first started framing the question, you were talking in terms of artists not getting their work shown, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
The only thing that an artist can really control is the work that they make. And so if you're making compromises in the studio because you think it will make you more accessible or accepted, then you've already kind of lost the game, right? Because what am I doing in my space? That's the only thing I can really control out of this profession. I can't control who writes on me. I can't control who gives me shows. I can't control who gives me grants. The thing that is authentic and true is my labor, my work, my thoughts, my being in the studio. So, I've never, and it's not to say that you don't have moments where you see that one thing is selling more or getting accepted more. I say I was telling students one time, I was like, yeah, I have this piece. I love it. I don't think it photographs well. And it never gets anywhere. I still love it though, right? But there's other things that I know that people are more receptive to. I'm not interested in making 1,000 more of those things, right? That's not how I want to spend my time. So I think this, this way that you think that you can somehow figure out what the art world wants, maybe you can, but is that sustainable for you? And do you want to keep doing it? I think that's a question all artists have to ask themselves, but I wouldn't start there with looking on the outside. I would start looking in the inside. And then I would look for people who are interested in what your work looks like. And it's hard to do that, but it does, and it takes time to try to, get ourselves out in the world so we can find that, is there someone who's like-minded or who is engaged with your work? And then, mess with those people. Don't mess with the other ones.
That's a great point. I love that, Tammie. Thank you so much. And that was honestly beautifully said. We do have another question from our Q&A area.
It looks like Elena wanted to say something.
I'm so sorry, Elena.
It's okay. It was just kind of on my thoughts with exclusionary based on identity, because I come from a mixed heritage of being Black and Hispanic. Sometimes I'm not allowed in the Black community because they don't consider my experience very valid, or I'm not allowed in the Hispanic community for the same reason. And I think it's very important to own your identifiers, even when people are trying to reject them or reject you because of them, because in this world we live in, racism is so prevalent in the foundations of our country that the moment you stop fighting for what you are owed is the moment that you validate their reasons for excluding you. So when I'm Black and Hispanic, I always say it up front in people's faces, regardless of how they feel I should be in it.
Could I say one last thing on this topic? I think as someone who's studied art history for a really long time and who's chosen to study issues of identity and in particular African American art, I had to study all of art history, and then I had to study Black art history. Now, the people who are doing white art history just have to study white art history. And so those of us who were doing ethnically specific and or some other identity specific art practice or art history, or histories of art, I'll say that, Cary, to include you, are doing white and our specific stuff. And so we actually have more of a learning curve and more to learn because they make us learn it both. Whereas people who are just studying white art only have to do that. They have to do less than we have to do.
I think that's a great point. Dr. Cordova, it looks like you want to add something.
Well, I was I know we want to move on to the next question, but there's so much sort of ringing in what both Elena said and Cherise has said, and I think you know, especially just like as somebody that teaches college students, it can be such a struggle for students to know who they are, right? Like, I mean, I'm so glad you have like this sort of strong sense of yourself, right? But it takes a lot to even get to that point, and some maybe never get there in terms of feeling like that level of confidence or that level of certainty about who they are. And I do think that that's one of the reasons why I love art so much, is because it is a practice that allows you the opportunity to contest ideas, right? To really grapple with all of these kinds of bits of information that we're all confronting on a regular basis. And so I think I was just processing that and thinking also about what Cherise was saying about how you have to learn all of our history and then you know, problematize it, right? And then sort of like, why is it being categorized in this way, or why are we understanding it in this way? I'm thinking about some of the artists that I've looked at and thinking like, even when they think that they're participating in, say, like an abstract movement, they're participating in something that is deemed like a larger genre, they're often read still outside that frame. For, you know, for whatever reason, like maybe like it's colors, right? Maybe it's like iconography in some way. It doesn't, there are just so many things that seem to happen that also contribute to the ways in which people feel they're being read through art or being labeled in different ways.
I think that's a great point too, Dr. Cordova. Tammie, would you like to speak to that as well?
Well, I just wanted to actually kind of say something to Elena. I mean, your experience is, you know, it's a difficult place to negotiate, but also you know, I find that there are people who are always negotiating the blackness or the brownness or like the queerness of individuals, right? And it made me think that when I went to grad school, there was one professor who I could tell during my first year was disappointed that I was not the kind of Black person he thought I was. You know, he really wanted some stories, I think, about like the ghetto. And he really wanted some stories about my oppression. You know, that was what he was on board for. And it made me, you know, so that person became untrustworthy to me, right? So I'm definitely not going to share information with you, right? And so there are all these ways that people put their perceptions about who you are, and they project them onto you. And it's something that you just, I mean, I don't have a happy ending to this story, but it's something that you can negotiate through just, you know, through the world, right? And you know, one thing is that as I've gotten older, I can see them coming quicker. You know what I mean? I think that, you know, the way that I would think of like, well, maybe I should give this person a benefit of the doubt. Like there's less of that because it's like, oh, I've seen this before. I know what it is. So, and I don't have to continue to give that person a lot of my attention or of my time because it's wearing on me as an individual. And we have to save ourselves from being, from undue anxiety when our lives are full of them all the time. So.
Thank you for that. I totally get where you're coming from because it's happened to me very often where people try to curate my experience for me or tell me what it's like to be me. And after a while, my eyes just start to glaze over and I'm just like, I'm gonna make whatever I want. You're gonna have to deal with it. Yeah, I feel like people think I'm like this nice, quiet, like person of color, like I'm the model minority. And then I open my mouth and they're like, oh, never mind. So, yeah, I tend to own my identity very strongly because I know people try to take it away from me.
Thank you so much, Elena, for sharing that experience. I feel like there's a lot of people out there, and especially within our community, that have similar feelings. And I really appreciate that you shared that with us. And you know, Tammie, I'm really glad that you know, hyped Elena up. I think that's a really important thing to do, especially, you know, in this community. It's not always easy to do so. Yeah, that was a nice little feel-good moment. I enjoyed it very much. And then I appreciate it. We do have a couple more questions coming in, and I just wanted to make sure that we're able to get to a few points, just mostly about what we as a community can do to hold the art world accountable moving forward. Tammie, you submitted a point earlier this week about, you know, what can we do once once the movement slows down, or once it's no longer like a buzzword or something like that. But I think that's really important to identify as well. But so for these questions, let's see. We have one from Johanna asking about encyclopedic museums. How do you think encyclopedic museums should contend with historical racism? Earlier, there was a mention in how museums can push forward narratives, but what about the pain, harm, violence of the past? Can encyclopedic museums ever do better, or should they cease altogether, to which then smaller specific museums rise to mainstream levels? How do we call for more BIPOC curators without laboring them to clean up the historical mess of their institutions? That's a really great question. And again, a little longer, so please feel free to unpack it a little bit at a time.
I'll just jump in on that one because I do think they should. I'm reminded of the National African American Museum in Washington, DC, because it's curated so incredibly and so beautifully with so many like rich sort of tapestries of stories and art, and of course dealing with racism. So I think there are ways that museums and institutions can step up and really grapple with these narratives, but the refusal or the sort of unwillingness or the fear of grappling with them is a larger problem. And so I think I would love to hear my colleagues on the panel here talk about this, but I definitely think that it's possible that we see other museums that are able to grapple with these issues. Don't just make it like, you know, a story of victimhood or, but really sort of talk about what happened so maybe things can also change.
Shout out to Johanna out there. Johanna's my former student. I mean, you know, this is a super complicated question, and I tend to agree as a person who is committed to artworks that museums should exist, and even encyclopedic museums should exist. You know, the very bases on which they are formed are corrupt, and there's not really ways to get around that. How to dismantle the racism and the colonialism that even brought them into being is, I mean, I don't even know how to do that. You know, small steps are to have more people whose identities are wrapped up in their objects as part of intellectual workers on the staffs of museums. But even that is, you know, only going to get us so far. And, you know, when I think about repatriating objects, when I think about objects and works that have been stolen from their home cultures decades and centuries and millennia ago, and how do they get returned? How do cultures make themselves feel whole again to get their objects back? I don't know.
I think that the refusal to make a truthful acknowledgement of what happened. And then sometimes if that could happen, and maybe these institutions see that the world would not shatter, their museum will not be emptied out. Because if we're going to be realistic, those institutions, or some of those institutions, are so large and have so much work that even if they tried to return it all, there wouldn't be a place for it to go. There wouldn't be enough institutions to put it into to be cared for, right? And so that's another thing. But to just say that multiple things can exist at the same time. This is the object. This was the architect who, not architect, the archaeologist who, did the dig, but most likely this is stolen, right? And you can just make those adjustments on the title cards. You can make those adjustments whenever you talk about that work. You can make those adjustments when you are signing your contracts to send the work somewhere else. And if the institution wants it back, and they, you can give it back, right? But I think to start first with the continual denial, the continual denial, I think, is the thing that has become so exasperated. And the idea that if you start to tell the truth, then what will happen? We already know that what happened, right? So just tell the truth about it. And we can accept, we all see that history is complicated, people are complicated, no one's one thing. So I think if the institution could start with internally by just being truthful about the objects, then that would be a great place to start.
Sorry. When thinking about museums, like encyclopedic ones, I feel like they even have narratives they want to push forward and art that they want, because at the end of the day, they're about making money too. And so it's like big names, recognizable names, things that people like understand, especially when they bring in like small exhibitions around certain topics. Like if it's Black History Month, all of a sudden they'll have an exhibition around Black artists. I think to help combat that sort of like specific narrative that they're trying to push around their art, around their institutions, is to collaborate with maybe smaller, more specific institutions around people of color and LGBT. So like maybe they come in and curate the show for them, and it gains visibility back to their institution. So I feel like collaboration would help a lot with this problem, because not one person can't take on this problem alone. I mean, that's the whole point.
I think that's a great point, Elena. That's a great point for you to point out. We do have some questions rolling in, and anybody who has a question, I would like to encourage you to ask either here on the Zoom Q&A or on Facebook if you're watching Facebook Live. So the first is from Adam Bennett, asking the panelists to speak about underrepresentation among museum and gallery staff. Adam gave an example. The Blanton in September 2019 had only one employee whose identity was listed as Black or African American. That's 1.1% of the Blanton staff, compared to 6% of UT staff being Black or African American. And that single employee earned the lowest salary for any museum employees, according to the data published by Texas Tribune. And so the question Adam poses is, how do we change this?
I think, Adam, you've already started, right? So giving out the facts, putting out the information. UT is a public institution. The Blanton is part of that institution. And so as like this kind of information comes out, now are there other people who will also, back Adam on that? Are there going to be, how many other people can now bring that same information back to the Blanton and ask them what they're going to do about it?
I think it kind of relates to the contemporary example where somebody was rejected because of their background. I think a step forward would be to recognize that people of color have the knowledge and experience and are valuable in these positions. Whereas I think that's the underlying reason, sometimes institutions just don't find us very valuable for what they want to present to them. So they're like, oh, they're a person of color, so they couldn't possibly be able to curate all these white exhibitions through the lens that I want to show, because naturally we have a different lens. Doesn't mean we can't do the work. It just, we have to I hate that we have to show people that we can. I think it's the mindset thing that we are valuable and visible and able to do the work that they want us to.
Yeah, institutions are very happy to also use us. So I would also point that out.
That's a good point, Dr. Smith. And I think really from everything that we've talked about today, it's really finding that balance between the two. We have another question coming from Pam. And Pam says,
Carrie's got her hand up.
I see it now. Sorry.
I'm so sorry. No, I mean, it wasn't anything grand. I just, to follow on what Cherise is saying is like also a lot of like in terms of getting used, a lot of times Black, Indigenous people of color are getting used, but they're not on staff, right? Like, so they're hired temporarily. They're not given like permanent positions. And so, maybe there's some sort of representation that is happening, but it's an only temporary representation. And this just goes to the heart of like how important it is to actually make, permanent positions in places of power, like the Blanton, and thinking like that hiring practices like if those are the numbers, that's embarrassing. Like that's just plain embarrassing, and it needs to change. It needs to evolve, and I mean, whether it's like to reflect the population of Texas or perhaps then some, because like the dimensions of white supremacy and power are tremendous, and there really needs to be like a huge flipping and challenging of what has so often functioned within the United States.
And can I follow up on that a little bit? I also think that the statements that have come out from institutions, and this is not about the Blanton, this is all like most institutions, the statements that they put out, the new committees that they're going to form, the consultants that they're going to hire, all the things that are going to come in the future down the road, maybe to address these issues of equity, where there's common sense things that they can do right now. And like Adam has like pointed out, go through your institution and make sure that your compensation is fair for women, people of color. Make sure it's fair. Right? Like, look at the numbers. You have access to the numbers, right? We also know that when women of color, when people of color apply for jobs, they're usually offered a lower rate. So if you're hiring someone, don't hire them based on whatever their previous salary was. Hire them at the salary that you pay other people at your institution. We're all continuously having to catch up. And it's also, again, this thing I said about earlier about this feeling like, well, they're here. We got them here. We feel really good about that. We're patting ourselves on the back. Okay, but now they're there. Are you giving them the same kind of raises that you're giving everyone else, right? Are you making sure that their labor and that their pay is equitable? So I think that there's so many simple things that institutions could do that does not take a new diversity and inclusion hire and a committee and all of that you could do to make yourself a better institution with just a little bit of actual common sense work.
I think that also speaks to what you said earlier, Tammie, about, starting from within the institution and not looking at it from an outside point of view. And I think that's absolutely true in this case and in all these cases. Okay, so question from Pam. Pam says, it was kind of discussed, but if there's enough time to dive into it more, there's some discussion on POC artists being whitewashed when they create work or use art techniques that were primarily created by white artists. Could you respond to that? In addition, should art museums catering to ethnic specific artists also make a point to display art that doesn't necessarily involve social issues or struggles associated with the artist's identity?
Absolutely. And in terms of the last question, sure. I think that it is racist, fundamentally racist, to assume that people of color should have to paint about difficult issues or social justice only, or represent, make art that represents racism or some other troubled topic. That's just wrong. Artists of color should make the work that they want to make based on the issues that they're interested in, as other artists do.
I can speak a little bit to the whitewashing part of the conversation, where I had an experience very recently where a professor tried to, I'm going to say curate what I was making through their lens. And it was highly inappropriate because she insinuated that I didn't understand my experience and she understood it better, and that she could make art around my experience better than I could. So I guess when dealing with situations like that, I think you just have to hold true to your guns and realize that some people just aren't going to get it because they don't have a perspective that's like you. And you'll find people that understand your art, are willing to meet you halfway, or even try to understand better. Because some people are just like walls. They don't take anything.
I'll just, I'm pretty much in agreement with what's been said here. And I think that people of color often experience a lot of pressure to represent. And, nobody can experience that all the time, right? Like, I mean, there's just a way in which you just also want to be an artist and do your work and really sort of imagine and create, and the pressure that goes with representation for all people or all groups is somewhat unattainable and anxiety producing. And so I think it's really important for us to not have some sort of aesthetic representation on what people want to create or imagine. Like I'm not saying that we're not interested in equity and inclusion, but I am saying, like, people are artists. That doesn't mean that they need to respond to every issue, per what Cherise was saying.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I'm not sure about the first part of the question. I don't think I quite understand the first part of the question. But the second part of the question, when we talk about museums catering to ethnic-specific artists to make a point to display art that doesn't involve social issues. Well, I think social practice is a form of artwork that maybe has been left out of the curatorial discussion, maybe, or in grants, and may have been a hard fit. And now we're at a time where it is, I see more applications that are asking for that, right? But then we go to the other thing. If everything is now asking for that, who else are you leaving out, right? So it's this measure of it's the same thing. No BIPOC people are like, we're not monoliths, right? So we make all kinds of different art. And in the regard of trying to make like a statement, an institution to make a statement, so therefore they only offer opportunities. Sorry, I've been teaching today, so it's like I've already done so much talking. Only offer opportunities to certain kinds of artists because they feel like that will bolster whatever their agenda is, right? And so that becomes problematic as well. There should be a place that artists are free. All artists are free in their making, and it should be free for them to show the things that they want to show and not be pigeonholed into whatever the higher institution think is trendy for the moment. I'm not saying they're all doing that, but I'm saying that it can become that very easily if you see that everything is looking for that, and then it just disappears, right? Where's the consistency? So
I'll just because I was thinking a little bit about the first question and thinking about what does it mean to be whitewashed when and one of the things that occurs to me is, you know, I mentioned like abstract art, which is very esteemed at times in Western art, but a lot of that was based on a kind of primitivism, right? So it was actually the imitation of African art. It was the imitation of indigenous art that then proceeded to create a kind of high art, high abstraction. But then when Black, Indigenous, and people of color did that art, then it was presumed that they were simply imitative, right, of the high art, of the abstraction, as opposed to recognizing like these other ties and these other sort of complications and the co-optation of cultures that was also underwriting some of that. And so I think that that's just one of those examples that illustrates like the kind of problems that people of color experience as artists when they are actually trying to like pay homage to you know, cultural work, and yet it's read in these other frames.
I would add that I think that whitewashing is just another way. Whitewashing argument is just another way to exclude artists of color. It's another way to push them off to the side and keep us out, essentially.
I think that's a really good point, Dr. Smith. Tammie, did you want to follow up to that?
Yeah, I think that I think that that's why I was having a hard time with the trouble, because I don't feel like any of the art techniques are techniques that just white artists came up with. So I think that that's why I was having a hard time with it, because, you know, painting doesn't involve none of these techniques belong to like one group of people ever.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that kind of goes back to what Dr. Cordova was saying about that presumption and that immediate accusation that just because somebody else is using a similar style or medium doesn't mean that they're copying. It's just part of it. Okay, so let's see. Got a few more questions here today. So we had an anonymous question. Does having minority-specific art museums automatically forfeit them as being considered American art? Tammie, you look like you're ready to answer this one.
No. Full stop. No, because, you know, we are American.
Yes.
We're American even when America does not want us. We are American.
I think everyone's pretty in accordance with that answer. So we have a question specifically for Elena. For Elena, how was your culture experience in the Far East different from the United States, as people of color are usually lumped into one category? And this came from Norman Brown.
Yeah, I was abroad for a little while in Japan, and I think I'm used to being stared at here in America, and I don't know why it would have been different when I went to Japan, but I felt more like an oddity pretty much everywhere I went, because they're very homogenous there. They're not used to seeing maybe people that look like me, especially with my cultural intersections. I did think it changed me in a way where I was able to own myself a little bit better, like, because I didn't really have a choice. So I think my experience with the Far East had changed me as an artist because I felt more comfortable with exploring my culture in my art.
Very cool. So our curator and director of programs, Dr. Vargas, has a question for our panel. There's an essay written in 1990 published by Art in America called Are Museums Racist by Maurice Bagger. And Dr. Vargas was saying that I'm sure some of us might not remember, and that's okay if you don't know the answer, but if you are familiar with it, he wants to know what your thoughts are on the essay or what your response would be to it.
Yeah, Maurice Berger just passed away in the early weeks of COVID. He was a Jewish American gay art historian who studied very well art by people of color. And Adrian Piper was one of the big people that he studied, for example. Actually, why don't I stop there and let someone else say something?
I don't know if I know that particular article, but likewise, I've taught from Maurice Berger, and I appreciate the. Actually, I've taught more about his writing about civil rights on television, right? Like in representation in that regard, and thinking about like how we see civil rights issues on sitcoms, or and so that's. The question, though, is striking, right? Like the question that starts the article, "Are museums racist?" And it, you know, for looking historically, like that makes a lot of sense as a question to ask. There are plentiful reasons why one could come to that conclusion, but do they need to be? Like, you know, which is also maybe the question that could frame some of what we're asking here, right? Or thinking about like what, you know, what does it mean to really rethink representation in museums, or, you know, and recognizing like the movement around, you know, museums are not neutral, they're not. And so thinking how we can challenge some of these ideas. And that's been a long time coming. Like people have been asking those questions for a long time now. And sometimes it gets really frustrating to be asking the same questions about change. But I'd also like to think that we have seen some evolutions. Sometimes the numbers don't look so good, but there are definitely ways in which I see some of the artists that I've written about in the past attaining a different form of respect today. And so that gives me some hope, and I'll just leave with that.
I went to a parochial high school in Chicago, and my brother went to the same high school, and we're about 10 years apart. And when he went to the institution, we went to that school, Luther South, it was probably like 70% white and like 30%, you know, Black. And when I went there, it was flipped, but we still had a lot of the same teachers were still there, right? And there was an English teacher, and you know, Black students would say, because he had tendencies to be like, are you racist, or are you a racist? And he would say, I try not to be. And I thought that answer, I still think about that answer a lot, because it means that he acknowledges that it's within him. It means that he has to have a self-awareness about his behavior, that he can easily understand how he slips into bias and racism. But if you are only asking the question and you're not acknowledging it as a possibility, I'm not sure what you're trying to get to. Like, what if you just started with yes, and then moved on from there and then acted accordingly? What if you did that? Like, what would, you know, like, we could stop having the discussion about is it or isn't it, and we could just move forward with making sure that there is equity in the institution. How much time is wasted by always having these questions this way when we can just move forward? And I will say that I don't remember that article. So, but from the way that it's being phrased is that I think that I was listening to the podcast, Nice White Parents. I don't know if anyone's listened to it. It's fantastic. It's interesting to me that it's a serial podcast, but it's not blowing up. And there's a lot of reasons why. And part of it is this idea of like people being called on acknowledging the things that they say their values are and how they actually live their values, right? So you say you do these things, but then when we look at your life, they don't seem to be reflected in your everyday life, right? And so it's the awareness, acknowledgement, instead of debating, are you or are you not? Let's just say yes, okay, and then work accordingly from there.
Not very familiar with that article, but I think it is a very important question asked up front as like the main point. And I would say to that, I think museums might be biased because from a curating art perspective, but also from viewership, like I've always loved museums, but they haven't always loved me being in them. I often get followed around by docents and security when I'm at museums. And I think that's just a bias that they have, whereas they don't see people like me in their space very often. So I'm an other in a sense, especially when their work is more Western and classical. They assume that I shouldn't be in a space like that. So I think museums should look at their demographics and also how they treat people in their own institutions.
I think that's a really great point. And I want to commend all of you on your answers, especially Tammie. I think that was a really powerful example of what we need to do within our own institutions. We have one more question today, and then we'll wrap up. And again, I just want to thank all the panelists for spending their time with us and for taking the time to talk to us about this today. We really appreciate your views and your opinions, and I hope that everyone can take what we talked about moving forward and really examine their own communities. So the last question today, do you believe the roles of museums and artists have changed / should change in the times of a pandemic and political unrest? What should that role look like for both the museums and the artists? And that's coming from Jose Martinez.
I guess I can start out. I believe museums have a great opportunity to make themselves more accessible to people because they don't have, like, you can't go to places as much anymore, especially with social distancing. They have an opportunity to curate things online, sort of like we're doing right now, where they might be able to have more talks or walkthroughs that are online and more information that maybe people wouldn't get just walking around by themselves. I also think, as regards to artists, I think artists have always made work based on the world around them. And I believe that history is much more relevant when it's told through an artist's lens, because I feel like histories can be rewritten, but you can't really change the context of a painting or a print or what somebody's creating from their experience around them. So I feel like artists have a very important role right now in depicting all the things that are happening right now.
I can go, and I can just say that it's an interesting question, because the question is like, do you believe the role of museums and artists have changed or should change? And then it's like in the time of a pandemic and political unrest, right? So there's like yes, I think they should change. And then is the question really like, should they change now? Because we're in a pandemic, or should they not because we're in a pandemic? I think that might be sort of what's ringing there. And as somebody that's also taught a lot about disasters, I actually think it's imperative that they change right now. Because one of the things that happens in the midst of a disaster, and we're seeing it right now, is massive social change. right? It's actually like a pattern that we have seen, and we have seen it before. Like, and so you have like a very brief window within the midst of a disaster in which you suddenly see like the possibilities, because people actually do think that the things need to change. And then people get used to the disaster, right? And there's just a kind of pullback. And so I actually would say, yes, absolutely, in this moment, it is vital to change, because this is a key moment to address some of these issues. And if we don't do it now, I would be very concerned about simply the pullback and the failure not to. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I feel like there's times of momentum, and in that momentum, what can you get done? I mean, if we just look from the global uprising that happened in spring to now, I mean, the list of things that have been accomplished, not all the things that we actually asked for, but the things that have been accomplished, has been, it's been rapid paced, right? And we know that this time is going to come to an end, right? And so it's going to slow way down. So holding the museums, holding the educational institutions, holding them to the fire, it's not finite. There is going to be a moment where there's going to be they're going to feel less pressure. And so in that moment, we have to see if we can push things forward. And one thing I would like to see that would happen with museums in particular, because they have been such a respite for me my entire life, right? So it's a complicated relationship, but I fucking love museums. Oh, sorry to small children out there in the world. But I want it to be a place that is sustainable as a job for everyone who works there, though. I mean, that's what I would really like to see happen. I would like it to be a livable wage for everyone involved.
I think these are all great points. Dr. Smith, did you have anything you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question. I think it's a good one and a complicated one. Certainly artists are making work right now, and they'll be making work for years afterwards about what's happening right now. And I think that one of the things that museums could be doing, and I don't really see a lot of them doing it, is to kind of go back and look at works that were created in these times of catastrophe and challenge. There's a lot of work that is about, depressions and hurricanes and famine and all kinds of human suffering that happens. Yeah, I mean, I do have a lot more thoughts on it, but museums are important institutions, and yes, they should rise to this challenge in the ways that they can.
Excellent. Perfect way to end that. I want to thank all our panelists again for being here today, for sharing. We are very appreciative of you and very thankful that you're able to take this time with us. Really quick, I just want to thank our sponsors, the City of Austin Cultural Arts Division, National Endowment for the Arts, 3M, Texas Commission of the Arts, and the Stand with Austin Fund, facilitated through the Austin Community Foundation. And then I wanted to thank our community builders who helped share this event today, the Women of Color Collective, Corinne Grovey Photography, Culture Strike, and ENX Creative. Thank you to everyone who shared the panel. Thank you for sharing the link. And again, thank you for being here with us today. Again, thank you to the panelists. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Mexic-Arte will be posting this on our YouTube channel in case you missed any of it, or if you'd like to share it later on. Be sure to follow us on all the things. We hope to have more programs like this soon. So, all right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Appreciate your moderating.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. I'll see y'all
Thank
next time.
you.
All right.